Hey guys, it's Michelle with MHG Counseling, and this is Commit to the Awkward. Welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about something that comes up in the counseling room all the time, and that's the topic of managing expectations and dealing with disappointment. Now, I'm sure even as I said that, you're thinking of a few disappointments you're working through right now, and so I hope these videos will really serve to help you to understand why disappointment can really lead us into some major struggles with God or major struggles with our emotions or with other people, and then what we can do to combat that. So this video will be divided up into two parts. The first will be looking through the problem of unmet expectations, how that can lead to chronic disappointment, the expectation gap, and negative ways in which we respond to disappointment. And so it's really important to watch this video first before moving on to video 2, which is then going to be okay, now what? What do we do with this? So as I do with most topics, when I'm talking about things that we're dealing with in day-to-day life, I like to use the narrative that is used a lot in Christian circles, and it's the creation, fall, redemption framework. And so for those of you who maybe are new to the faith or aren't really seeking that out right now, I don't want to leave you behind, so I will explain it very briefly. So creation is the basics. I'm sure you've probably heard some version of the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden, where life is perfect, it's beautiful, and they walk in uninterrupted relationship with God. But then they disobey God. He had this one rule that they couldn't eat from a tree that really wouldn't be good for them. But they doubted God's goodness, and they listened to the lies of the serpent, and they ate of the fruit. And then there is what happens after that, the fall. And so the fall in that, of course, begins with them disobeying God, and then the consequences of the fall, which are shame, anxiety, anger. They can no longer live in the garden. You know, childbirth is going to be painful. Work is going to be hard and sometimes not fruitful. And so that's that fall. That's where we see a lot of brokenness and disappointment coming into the story. And then there's redemption, and that'll be more, we'll cover that more in the video tomorrow. But the redemption narrative is that as early as chapter 3 in the whole book of the Bible, as early as chapter 3, God comes in and says, hey, I am going to send someone who can live the perfect life you can't, to die for your sins and to raise again from the dead, so that you will always be in uninterrupted relationship with me. But not only that, part of God's redemption is while we are still here on this earth, living in the brokenness of the world, living in the brokenness of our own sinful hearts, He's also going to give us practical ways to walk through that too. So I hope this video will serve you well in that. But let's start with creation when we're thinking about disappointment, when we're thinking about managing expectations. So creation, it all starts with wonder. Now, when I say that, think of the image of a baby. If you've ever had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with an infant, you'll recognize that everything seems incredible to them. A ceiling fan, a cat walking by, the leaves blowing, they giggle, they laugh, all these things that you and I take for granted. A baby is just, they're filled with wonder. And then you and I have had the experience of going somewhere for the first time. Maybe for you it was the Grand Canyon, and we are in wonder. We just can't believe all of this beauty exists. And so in that framework of creation, fall, redemption, this world started in wonder. It started in wonder of an amazing God. It started in wonder of the environment. It started in the wonder of the relationship between the man and the woman. And so there was wonder. The Greek word for wonder is thalma. I'm from the South, so I usually say words weird. So I'm sure there's a lot of biblical scholars out there right now that are laughing at me, but that's my best attempt, thalma. But it is in the early accounts of the Bible, and we see that everything is wonderful and God is wonderful. It all starts with wonder. And then there is the fall. So let's go back to the image of that baby. So after a while, the baby realizes the ceiling fan is really not all that magical. It's just a ceiling fan. And that baby's going to continue to grow up and get older and go to school. And then they're going to realize that sometimes people hurt their feelings, or sometimes they work really hard and they still don't make the team, or sometimes bad things are happening in their family life that they can't control. And so that baby, that place of wonder, is now impacted by the fall. And I'm sure right now you're thinking of a few places where your wonder has been broken, whether it's in present day or in the past. And so when we think of this idea of disappointment, we can take heart that in the Bible, there are also lots of examples, biblical examples of disappointment. For example, I think the most obvious one is when Jesus arrives on this earth, people are disappointed in how he is as a man. A lot of people, as they were waiting for the Messiah, they envisioned this conqueror. He was going to come in and he was going to clean house and he was going to turn over the governments and he was going to make it all right. It was going to be very tangible justice, and it was probably going to be really swift and violent. And then here comes Jesus, meek and mild. People are disappointed. Then you have King David, who before is chosen to be king, his father doesn't even bring him out. This prophet Samuel comes and he says, hey, bring me all your boys, because one of your boys is supposed to be the king. And his father didn't even think to bring David because David was short. He just wasn't what you would imagine a king to look like. It was a disappointment, maybe, to people. The Bible doesn't say, but he was not what people expected a king to look like. Then you have other examples of people having to wait a really long time. You have Abraham and Sarah, and God shows up and says, hey, you guys are going to have a baby, and they have to wait a super long time. A super long time. They are ridiculously old by the time they have that first child. They were disappointed every month, I'm sure, to find out that this was not going to be the month that they would be having their baby. So we see all sorts of examples of biblical disappointment. And then we look at modern day, and I don't have to do anything to really conjure your minds on the disappointments. You're thinking of them now. Maybe it's some natural disaster events you've been recently going through. I know here in Florida we had hurricanes. Obviously we've got fires. We've got all of these other, really upsetting ways that nature has failed us. And then there is disease, there's sickness, there's broken relationships. Again, I don't have to tell you. And then there's more comical versions, which is if any of you have ever gone to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa, I know that we're all kind of surprised. It's like, honestly, this little tiny painting under a glass case, and there's lots of people looking in, and it's a little disappointing because when you see it on the web, it looks huge, it's exciting, and it's disappointing. So whether we're talking about the really big, painful disappointments in life or the smaller ones, those things exist, and they can cause us to feel discouraged, disappointed, cynical. And so we've got the biblical days of biblical examples of disappointment. We've got the modern examples of disappointment. But let's think through this in two major categories, because I think if we're going to tackle this, sorry, I have hair bothering me here. If we're going to really tackle this well, it's important to break up the category of expectations into two subcategories. And so I like to call the first category broken world disappointments. So this is what we would talk about, things that are out of our control, natural disasters, sickness, death, any number of other things. These are things we really they're out of our hands. So that's broken world disappointments. And then there's this category over here, and this category is big, and it's the category of unrealistic expectations. And this is the one, my friends, we can do a lot of work in. And that's going to be what, we're going to definitely, for those of you who are going through broken world expectations, in that second video, we're definitely going to address that. So don't think we won't. But all of us in some way, shape, or form have unrealistic expectations when it comes to people in our lives, circumstances, events, you name it, right? When we put up, maybe it's like throwing the perfect party, or maybe it's thinking that difficult relationship, every time you hang out with a person, it's, a train wreck, but maybe this time it's going to be perfect. And these unrealistic expectations, that's where we really want to pay attention and dig in. And here's why. So psychologists have something that they call the expectation gap. And what they have found is that the larger your expectation gap, the bigger the disappointment if that expectation is not met. So if we think about it like this, with unrealistic expectations, so if I were to say, I am going to go on a vacation and it is going to be perfect. It is, everybody's going to have a great time. Everybody's going to be super thankful. The kids aren't going to complain once. The weather's going to be astounding. The place we stay is going to be immaculate. The larger that expectation gap, the more I set myself up for disappointment. And so if I am constantly setting expectation gaps that cannot be met, I am going to be disappointed over and over again. And what psychologists have found is that the more we can narrow that expectation gap, the more we can say like, hey, I'm going on a vacation and it's going to be great. Like, I'm not going to be negative about it, but there'll probably be some things that don't look exactly like I expect, and I will be okay regardless. Then we're narrowing that expectation gap, and the chance for disappointment is a lot less. And therefore, we don't have to worry as much about being devastated when our circumstances, the people in our lives, whatever, fail us. And so why that's super important is because they found with that expectation gap that the more we are disappointed, the more we set this unrealistic expectation, and the more we're disappointed in that, it can actually lead to chronic disappointment. And there are two major ways that I see chronic disappointment manifest in our lives, show up in our lives. And one is anger and resentment. We can become cynical of life. We can become cynical of people, of relationships. And then the other one is despair, brokenness, hopelessness. And so both of these categories, if you've ever been in that spot, I know I have, I've been in both of those in different times of my life, they really can block us from seeing what God is doing or what God wants to do, how he wants to help us through that. So that's all we're going to talk about in this video today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk more about, okay, practically, what does it look like to identify unrealistic expectations in your life, how to walk through that, set better expectations. And then we'll also work through what does it look like to deal with the disappointment when broken world expectations happen, when they are unmet.